Hey there, goblins. This is Goblin Salvage Rights. My name's Robert, and today I've got a Pathfinder Remastered TLDR for you. Basically, what I'm going to do is break up the remaster into 10 sections from least to most important. By the end of the video, you should have a pretty good idea of what's changed in Pathfinder Remastered and be able to rock up to a table and not be caught off guard. Now, if you haven't heard, Paizo has come out with a major revision to Pathfinder 2nd Edition called Pathfinder Remastered. It's basically Pathfinder 2.1. It is absolutely not a new edition of Pathfinder. Rather, it's a significant revision and consolidation of the rules that makes it more easy to play and get into, as well as allowing Paizo to separate themselves from Wizards of the Coast's evil OGL. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty, I want to let you know that Erik and I did not have an advanced or review copy of Pathfinder Remastered. We're not cool enough YouTubers yet, I guess. That means that we got our grubby little goblin hands on it on the 15th of November, just like everyone else. The good news, however, is that means we got to write the script with the errata. That brings us to a very funny and important unchange that happened at day one. Death and undying rules have not changed, ? Basically, the player core came out with a set of updated rules for death and dying that made death and dying much more deadly. However, when the errata dropped on the 15th, they just completely got rid of that change. So death and dying has not changed at all. If anything, we have a super hardcore mode for playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition at a higher stress rate, I guess. All that's to say, you don't need to worry about death and dying. It hasn't changed from the original version. Let's get into number 10, crafting rules. Crafting has changed in a substantial way. Originally, crafting took 4 days, and you needed a formula. Now, it only takes 2 days. And if you already have the formula, it only takes 1 day. That is a significant change. It allows you to enjoy downtime and actually get multiple things done in downtime. Now, all the other same rules are there as before. You still have to have the material components beforehand for the completion of the item. And then when you're done during that crafting period, you either pay the remainder or you use your downtime activity to make up the remainder as earned income. Now, our thoughts on this change is pretty straightforward. Downtime is a pain in the ass for most players. You know, they want to kind of just skip through it. Sometimes the narrative doesn't allow for enough downtime to get one item done at all, let alone multiple items. Sometimes the narrative is going so fast, you only have a day or two downtime to handle. Erik and I love these changes going forward and will be implementing them immediately. Number 9. Changes to actions. Disarm got a major buff, and now it's going to allow me to make a character I've wanted to make for so long. A spike chain wielding goblin who disarms and trips his foes. Now, on a success, your opponent takes a -2 circumstance penalty to attacks or to do pretty much anything else with the item you're disarming. Then you also get that additional +2 to make the next disarm attempt even more likely. They have to spend an interact action in order to readjust their grip and basically remove the debuff. And that debuff exists in perpetuity. So they have to spend that interaction to get rid of it. And if I have to remind you guys, interact has the move trait, which triggers attacks of opportunity or reactionary strikes. We'll get into that in a minute. Recall knowledge has been significantly changed. Now, it's a much more straightforward process in asking questions of your DM. You start with exactly that. You pick a skill, ask a question, roll a dice to see if you're successful, and then your DM answers that question. Now, the book goes into some detail about what a question looks like, how open-ended or close-ended a question can be. The best example I can come up with is, hey DM, what's that monster's worst save? Roll a dice, success. Well, Robert, their worst save is fortitude. Sweet, I'm gonna cast kill. Kill. That's not a spell. It should be though. Goblin kill spell. What I also liked was the book included a nice little section about how automatic knowledges work. What does an untrained knowledge check look like? A trained knowledge check, expert, master, legendary. What do I get to know for free by just looking at the opponent? And what do I get to know by thinking or pondering about that opponent? To me, that's always been the biggest feel bad when it comes to knowledge checks in general. Aid Another got a significant buff purely numerically. The check to make an Aid Another action has been reduced from 20 to 15. This is major. Every single time you go to roll an Aid Another action, you now only have to hit a target that's 5 less. That means critically succeeding and getting those sweet +2s, +3s, eventually +4s, 25% easier, which is massive in this game. All right, number 8, new actions. Paizo has introduced a couple new actions to Pathfinder 2nd Edition that we've kind of been wanting for a long time. Swapping items is now a thing via the interact ability. Swapping an item with an interact action is very straightforward. You have something in your hand, you use the swap action, put it away, and then grab something else that is easily accessible. Now, if you're dual wielding and you have 2 things in your hands, you have to spend 1 action to interact and swap each specific item or weapon. Now, I love this change because in the days of old, you had to drop items on the ground, and keeping track of those things and where you dropped them was always a pain to me. I know there's a level of verisimilitude that is maybe lost for some players, but from a gameplay perspective, it just makes everything way more clean and easy to play at the table. At the end of the day, that's what we want. We want rules that don't get in the way of the fun. Now we got a brand new action for the athletic skill called Reposition. Now you don't have to be trained in order to use this skill, thankfully. And what it allows you to do is, if you have a free hand or the target is grappled or restrained, it allows you to move them with a successful check. If you critically succeed, you can move them 10 feet within your reach, and you cannot move them through obstacles. If you succeed, you get to move them only 5 feet. Failure means nothing happens, as usual, but critical failure means they get to move you, which I think is hilarious. Imagine just trying to get grabbed and moved, and you're like, no, you. I can't wait for one of my goblins to pull that off. A very important note for this movement action is that it does not provoke attacks of opportunity or reactionary strikes to the person being moved. Very important and a big difference from editions of old, if you know what I mean. This is probably one of my favorite changes for strength-based builds in the entirety of the Remastered series, because it allows fighters and other strength-based martials to move opponents into a flanking position while mastering their athletics and giving them more and more opportunities to use athletics in combat. Pass off or take. Now, this is an interesting action you can make with the interact action that allows you to throw an item to one of your friends or just hand them off. Now, if you're throwing an item, you have to make an attack against a DC 15 with a 10-foot range increment. So basically you have to hit a 15, and just like a knife or something, any item has a 10-foot range increment. So now you can like throw a potion to your friend, and there are rules for it. If they're within melee range of you, you don't have to make any check, you just hand it to them. Number 7, general feat changes. Now, this is kind of a smorgasbord of important changes that have happened to general and skill feats that I think are significant. Now, I'm not going to cover all of these changes. I am going to cover the ones I think are the most important or the most interesting for gameplay going forward. Keep in mind that a lot of new feats have been added for crafting, so definitely go check that out. The Pathfinder Remastered book did an excellent job of organizing all of these feats by the skills that they interact with, just like they do on Archives of Nethius, so I'm very, very happy for that. First up on the list is armor and weapon proficiency. Now, when you take the feat that gives you proficiency in heavy armor or let's say martial weapons, you also get expert proficiency in that category at 11th level. This is a pretty good buff for casters or non-martials that really need to keep up with everyone else at the table. One of our favorite feats, Untrained Improvisation, now gives a smoother scaling to its ability. You don't just spike in your ability at 7th level. There is a bit of a tapering process that happens, and that is a very welcome change in my opinion, because it's one of my favorite feats. The additional lore feat gives you a lore of your choice, trained at level 1, and then at level 3, you become expert, level 7, you become master, and at level 15, you become legendary. This is a great buff, especially for ancestries that give you a free lore, because instead of just giving the lore trained, they now just give you this feat, which automatically heightens that ability as you level up. I love things that automatically heighten for you so you can use your skill increases for places that really matter to your character and its development. Rejoice, goblins! We can now have little furry friends as our pets with the pet feat. This effectively gives you a shitty familiar, if I'm being honest, but it's kind of fun because you can pick up a pet and train it. If it's an animal that burrows or flies, it gets one of those traits just like a familiar does. This is a really fun, and I could see it actually being kind of powerful feat that you can get at like level 1. Monster crafting. Okay, we have entered into Monster Hunter territory here. Now, when you slay a monster, if you're master in survival, you can cut that monster up, salvage some of its parts, and use those parts against the cost of crafting an item. Presumably, you use some of those as crafting materials to make armor and weapons. I love this so much, especially in my Kingmaker campaign. Erik has already talked about using it for his fighter druid, and I am so stoked for it. This may not be one of the most impactful feats in the entire remaster, but it's definitely one of the coolest. Number 6 is nomenclature changes. Now remember, we're getting away from the OGL, moving towards the ORC, the ORC license. And what that means is we have to rename a bunch of stuff because of the way that copyright and stuff works. Now, I'm going to leave a link in the doobly-doo down below to a document we've come up with that tells you all of the nomenclature changes. You should be able to print it out, bring it to your game, and make sure you use the right terminology. Frankly, I'm going to probably be using Attack of Opportunity until I die, but that's just me. In this category, they've also removed attribute scores or ability scores. So now instead of having a 12 in strength, you just have a +1. This makes perfect sense because those numbers were kind of golden cows left over from a bygone era. No ability or anything like that actually affects ability scores in PF2E. They just affect ability modifiers. So why not just get rid of the ability score and make everything a lot more simple? Why does a 12 translate into a +1? No. Now you just have a +1, a +2, a +3, a +4, a +5. Flat-footed has changed to off guard, which makes perfect sense. Attack of Opportunity, the big one for me, has been changed to reactionary strike. Spell levels have been changed to spell ranks. I really, really love this change in particular because new players often find it very difficult to understand the differences between player level and spell level, especially considering one is like exponential in power and the other one is linear in power. The elemental languages have been changed from some pseudo-Latin names to some pseudo-Greek names. Druidic has been changed to Wild Song. Metamagic has been changed to Spell Shape. Nephilim is now a new term for both Aasimars and Tieflings. They're kind of one and the same in many aspects. Very reminiscent of Diablo, in my opinion. Vitality and Void have replaced positive and negative energy types and damage in the game. Finally, Good and Evil have been replaced with Holy and Unholy. We'll get to the whole removal of alignment here in a minute. Number 5, Spell Schools. They have gone the way of the dinosaur and have been replaced with literal schools of magic that you can go to and study at. Conjuration, necromancy, all that jazz has been removed from the game. The tags are gone, except for illusion. We'll get to that here in a minute. All of those are gone, and what they've been replaced with are literal spell schools and lists that wizards can go to and study from. We'll get to the wizard changes here in a bit. Getting back to the illusion, they kept the illusion tag because they needed a mechanical way to interact with illusions, because we all know they interact with the game kind of differently. You can disbelieve them and stuff like that. So they kept that tag, but don't confuse it for the school that it used to be, because it's just a tag that has mechanics attached to it. Number 4, spell buffs and changes. Now, Paizo used this as an opportunity to rebalance and change a lot of the spells in the game. One of their main goals was to remove ability score modifiers from spell damage. So what they've done is in instances like cantrips where you added your ability score modifier to your D6 damage, they just gave you an extra die of damage. So what used to be 1d6 plus 4 ability score damage is now 2d6 damage. This does mean that a lot of spells have gotten a very minor nerf in their damage output by 1 or 2 points, but at the end of the day, this is a very, very minor nerf to all spellcasting. Material, somatic, verbal, and focus components have all been removed in favor of you speaking spells into the world, as well as creating some glowing runes in space. What's interesting is now you don't have to have a hand free when casting a spell. You can have your hands holding something like a shield and a wand or something like that, and you don't need a hand free to cast any of those spells. You do have to be heard, and you do have to create some runes that your opponents or friends or anyone around you can see. Some spells have gained the subtle tag, meaning you can cast them without any obvious manifestations. No hard, loud speaking or magical runes floating in the air. There's also meta magic or spell shape abilities that allow you to cast spells subtly. There's also been a major shift change in the way that you cast spells via a archetype or something like that. As you know, Erik and I love using archetypes, and this has made keeping up with the math of our archetypes much more simple. So basically what's happened is your proficiency rank is no longer in a school of spells. It's in spell casting, generally speaking. It's in your class. Whenever your main class casts a spell, whether it be a wizard casting an arcane spell or a wizard druid who has a druid archetype casting a primal spell, you always use the same trained modifier. However, these different classes do use different ability modifiers. So if you have a +4 in intelligence, your wizard will be, I don't know, let's say a 24. But if you have a 0 in wisdom, your ability will only be a 20, whether that be the DC or your to hit or something like that. Number 3, refocusing your focus pool. Now this is a pretty significant change to the balance of a lot of classes and archetypes in the game. Previously, you could only regain 1 focus point whenever you took a short rest for about 10 minutes. Now you can regain all of your focus points up to the maximum in your pool. This creates an incentive for you to use all of your focus points in a fight and then regain them after the fight. I mean, it only takes about 30 minutes to get back your whole focus pool. Before, you were always very hesitant to dole out that second and third focus point because you knew going forward you wouldn't have access to them for future fights. Now you can just go hog wild with all 3 of your focus points and gain them back after 30 minutes of refocusing. This is an amazing change for classes like the champion, for maguses, for psychics, and for witches. Any class or archetype that relies on focus points just got a huge buff. So keep that in mind when you're choosing your next class. Number 2 is alignment. It's gone. Just noped out of existence. I'm so jazzed about it. Now the alignment grid, good and evil, law and chaos, have been around longer than I have literally been alive. This is an exciting time to be here to see it disappear. But what has it been replaced with? Edicts and anathemas have stepped up to fill the space, especially in a religious context, that players need to understand where their gods lie and where their own beliefs lie. Now, edicts and anathemas are beliefs that don't determine but guide your character's actions. These are guiding lights in the darkness that is your character's development. Maybe they do step on the toes of one of their anathemas. Maybe they were forced to. Maybe they do so because they had a new change of heart. Something happened to them that changed them and significantly broke one of their anathemas. Their whole worldview has shifted because of a life-changing moment. These are the kinds of things that create wonderful stories that we're all trying to tell here. So with the alignment system gone, how are we supposed to play religiously oriented characters? Well, here comes sanctification. Sanctification represents the fight between good and evil as it exists in the outer planes. So we have the holy planes and the unholy planes, and they are in an eternal struggle, an eternal war. Some deities of clerics and champions will require them to sanctify to their side. Others will not really care if you sanctify at all. Some will specifically tell you you cannot sanctify. Holy and unholy are intrinsic to a creature or a spell. Spells and effects that once dealt alignment damage now do spirit damage. This is really interesting and exciting because it's so pervasive as we see it now that it is almost as powerful as force damage in a lot of ways. The only things that are immune to spirit damage are things that have absolutely no spirit, things like constructs. Number 1, class changes. Now, all of the classes in Pathfinder Remastered have gotten a significant update. Pretty much every class has had multiple feats updated or brand new feats added and also removed. However, no 2 classes changed as significantly as the Witch and the Wizard. Classes included in the Player Core 1 are the Bard, Cleric, Druid, Ranger, Rogue, Fighter, Witch, and Wizard. Now, I'm not going to do a deep dive into these major class changes right here. I'd like to keep this as a TLDR, short and sweet. I would like to cover some of the Witch changes and Wizard changes just so you have a good idea of what's going on. The Witch got the greatest of the remasters, or updates to the way they play. Fundamentally, they still work the same, believe it or not. They still pick a patron, and that patron gives them power, and they get hexes in the form of focus spells and focus cantrips to cast and do interesting things. The changes come in the way that they interact with their patron and the way they interact with their familiar. Familiars now have buffs that they can hand out based on your patron. You have special patron focus spells that you get through lessons and also directly from the patron itself. There's a whole list of extra spells you get to add to your spell list, of course, as well as specific feats that allow you to interact with your patron in new and interesting ways. If you were sleeping on the Witch before because it tasted too much like the Wizard, definitely go check it out now. I've always loved the Witch, but now I am more excited than ever to take a Witch out into a game and see what I can really do with it. Now, the Wizard's changes aren't as significant mechanically as they are significant from a narrative perspective. As I said earlier, spell schools are gone, and they've now been replaced with actual schools of magic. So now when you make a wizard, you pick what school they learned magic from. These schools are effectively just lists of spells that you get to cast for free, just like you do now, except it's a much more constrained list of things you can do. They also updated a couple of the focus spells, removed some, added new ones to the spell schools that made more and more sense. We have a school of combat, a school of creating walls and construction. We have a school of sigils and protection. It's much more narrative and thematic than before. From a balance perspective, this is a bit of a significant nerf to wizards actually, because they used to have a large pool at each spell rank that they could choose from to have as a free spell they got to cast every day. They're 3+1. Now they pretty much only have 2 spells to choose from at each rank. And when you constrain a class's ability to make choices, you also constrain their power in many ways. At the end of the day, the wizard changes seem super thematic, and I love the option of having a narrative to create new and interesting spell schools in the future. Who knows, maybe we might even create a goblin salvage rights school for an iconic goblin wizard. That sounds like a cool idea. There are many other changes that have happened to classes that I listed previously, so go check out Archives of Nethys once it becomes updated. I got one more bonus change for all of you goblins who stuck around with me. This one is about shields, believe it or not. Reinforcing shield runes exist now. It's effectively a fundamental rune that you can etch to your shields that adds hardness and HP. Before, you kind of had to have the trade-off between a cool shield and a tough shield. Something that does interesting stuff, or one that actually does its shield duties. Now, you can slap fundamental runes on your shields, and they can level with you. I didn't really know where to put this in the ranking, because it's a significant change to the balance of characters who use shields. Then again, there aren't a lot of classes in the new Player Core 1 that can even use shields. I mean, I think the fighter is really the only class that is any good at using the shields. Of course, the champion and other classes have access to cool shield abilities, but not in this book. Maybe in the next one. So this is your bonus tip for today. Thanks so much for hanging out with me, goblins. I really appreciate your time. We've got an awesome Discord with a bunch of great gobbos that are just hanging out, talking shop. We have a grand old time down there. We also have a wonderful Patreon where for $5 a month, you get access to custom third-party content that we make for goblin salvage rights every month. We have a whole 2024 roadmap you can go check out. I'll link it in the doobly-doo down below. If you're excited for what is in that roadmap, maybe you should jump into our Goblin Secret Society and start having some real fun. Thanks so much for hanging out with me again, goblins, and as always, keep it weird.